The exiled alien yelled, "Get in my bed. Human, we're freezing out here." The snow came down in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing within seconds, and the wind howled through the frozen wasteland like a living creature hungry for warmth and life and anything foolish enough to be caught outside in the blizzard that had descended without warning on the remote research station. Jake Martinez stumbled through the knee-deep drifts, his thermal suit doing little against the supernatural cold that seemed to pierce right through the advanced materials and into his bones, and he could barely see 3 feet ahead of him. But he knew the emergency shelter was close somewhere in this white hell, and he had to find it before his suit gave out completely. The distress beacon had come from this sector, a weak intermittent signal that barely registered on the station's long-range scanners, but protocols were clear, and when someone sent out an emergency call, you answered no matter what, and Jake had volunteered immediately because that was who he was, the kind of person who ran toward danger instead of away from it. He nearly tripped over her. The alien woman was half buried in a snowdrift, her silver skin nearly invisible against the white backdrop, and only the faint purple glow emanating from the crystalline structures along her spine gave her away, and she was curled into a ball, her body shaking violently, and her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. Jake dropped to his knees beside her, his gloved hands brushing away the snow and ice that had accumulated on her body, and up close. He could see she was unlike any species he had encountered in his 3 years working at the frontier stations, and her features were humanoid enough, sharp, elegant, with high cheekbones and a narrow nose, but her eyes, when they flickered open, were completely black, like looking into deep space itself. "Help," she rasped, her voice barely audible over the screaming wind, and her hand shot out with surprising strength and grabbed his wrist, and her grip was like ice but desperate and pleading. "I got you," Jake said, and he tried to lift her, but she was heavier than she looked, and his own body was already weakening from the cold, and the shelter is closed. "Can you walk?" She tried to stand, but her legs buckled immediately, and she would have face planted into the snow if Jake hadn't caught her, and he wrapped her arm around his shoulders and half carried, half dragged her through the blizzard, and every step was agony, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he kept moving because stopping meant death for both of them. The emergency shelter appeared like a gift from the universe, a small reinforced dome barely visible through the white curtain of snow, and Jake practically fell against the access panel, and his frozen fingers fumbled with the emergency override code, and for one terrible moment he thought the door wouldn't open, but then it hissed and slid aside, and blessed warmth rushed out to meet them. He pulled the alien woman inside, and the door sealed behind them, cutting off the wind and the cold, and for several long moments, Jake just lay on the floor gasping for breath, and his entire body shook with exhaustion and cold. And beside him, the alien woman had curled up again, her silver skin now looking pale and sickly. The shelter was basic but functional. A single room about 15 feet across with a small heating unit, emergency supplies, and a sleeping platform built into one wall, and Jake forced himself to move. And he activated the heater and cranked it up to maximum, and then turned his attention to his unexpected companion. She was in bad shape. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and those glowing crystal formations along her spine had dimmed to almost nothing. And he knew from his xenobiology training that many alien species had visible biological indicators of their health status, and dim lights were never a good sign, eh? Jake said gently as he knelt beside her, and he carefully rolled her onto her back, and her black eyes opened and fixed on him. And there was fear in those depths, but also a strange kind of resignation. "You saved me," she whispered, and her voice had an odd melodic quality to it, even weakened as it was. "Not yet," Jake replied, "but we're working on it. And what happened to you?" She was silent for a moment, and her eyes closed, and Jake thought she might have passed out. But then she spoke again. "Exiled," she said simply, and her hand moved to touch one of the crystal formations on her collarbone, "and banished from my ship, from my people." "Exiled," Jake repeated, and he felt a surge of anger on her behalf, because what kind of people would abandon someone in a blizzard? "And why I spoke against the council," she continued, and her eyes opened again, "and I questioned their decision to ignore your distress calls from the mining colonies, and they called me a sympathizer, a betrayer, and they left me here to die." The mining colonies, Jake felt his stomach drop because 3 weeks ago a series of colonies in the Outer Rim had gone dark, and the Federation had sent ships to investigate, but they had found nothing, and no survivors, no bodies, just empty, facilities and equipment left running. And there had been rumors, of course whispers, that maybe the colonies hadn't just suffered technical failures. Maybe something or someone had attacked them. Your people did that? Jake asked quietly. The alien woman shook her head weakly. No, but we knew who did, and the council chose to remain silent, and when I tried to warn your people, they silenced me instead. Jake sat back on his heels processing this information, and the implications were staggering because if this woman's people knew about an active threat to human colonies and had deliberately withheld that information, then they were complicit in whatever had happened, and he understood now why she had been exiled. Because speaking up against that kind of corruption took courage. What's your name? He asked after a moment. She looked at him and something that might have been surprise crossed her features. You want to know my name? Of course, Jake said. Why wouldn't I? Because I am nothing, she replied. And her voice was bitter. And I am cast out, dishonored, and my name holds no meaning anymore. It means something to me, Jake said firmly. And you're not nothing, and you're someone who tried to do the right thing, and that counts for a lot in my book. She studied him for a long moment, and then the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. Kira, she said. And my name is Kira. Nice to meet you. Kira, Jake said, and he extended his hand, and Jake. Kira looked at his hand uncertainly, and then reached out, and took it, and her skin was still cold, too cold, and Jake frowned. We need to get you warmed up, he said. And that heater is working, but it's not enough. And you're hypothermic. I am Valerian, she said. As if that explained everything. And we do not process heat the same way your species does, and without my ship's thermal regulators I cannot maintain my body temperature, and I will die slowly as my core functions shut down one by one. Jake felt panic rising in his chest because that was not an option, and he hadn't dragged her through a blizzard just to watch her die in this shelter. There has to be something we can do, he said. And what about shared body heat? And I know it sounds weird, but if your people are anything like humans, skin-to-skin contact is one of the most efficient ways to transfer warmth. Kira stared at him. You would do this, she asked, and her voice was filled with disbelief. And share your heat with an exile? Jake shrugged. You're not an exile to me, he said. And you're just someone who needs help. Kira's eyes widened, and those black depths seemed to shimmer, and for a moment Jake thought she might cry, but instead she nodded. Then I accept your offer, she said, and I do not wish to die. Jake helped her to the sleeping platform, and it was narrow, really only meant for one person, but they would make it work, and Kira began to remove what little clothing she wore, thin metallic strips that seemed to serve more ceremonial than practical purposes, and underneath her silver skin was marked with intricate patterns that looked almost like circuit boards, and those glowing crystals were embedded at regular intervals along her spine, her shoulders, and her collarbone. Jake turned away to give her privacy as he stripped off his own thermal suit, and the cold air of the shelter hit his skin and he shivered. But the heater was working and the temperature was rising slowly, and he kept his eyes averted until Kira spoke. I am ready, she said quietly. He turned back, and she was lying on the sleeping platform on her side, and her body was still trembling, and those crystals were so dim now they barely glowed at all, and Jake climbed onto the platform behind her and carefully wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close. Kira gasped at the contact, and her body went rigid for a moment. But then she relaxed and pressed back against him, and her skin was like ice against his chest, and he could feel her shaking. This is strange, she murmured, but not unpleasant. Just try to relax, Jake said, and let your body absorb the heat. They lay like that in silence, and Jake could feel Kira gradually warming against him, and her shaking began to subside, and the crystals along her spine started to glow a little brighter, and he found himself studying the patterns on her skin, and they really did look like circuitry, delicate lines that branched and connected in ways that seemed almost intentional. Are those natural? He asked quietly, gesturing to the patterns. Kira made a sound that might have been a laugh. Yes, and all Valerians have them, and they are part of our neural network, and they allow us to interface with our technology directly. That's incredible, Jake said. Kira was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke again, and her voice was softer now. Jake, and why did you come for me and you did not know who I was and you risked your life? Because it was the right thing to do. Jake replied simply. And someone needed help. And I could help. And it doesn't matter what species you are. You are strange, she said, but there was warmth in her voice now. I've been told that before, Jake said with a small smile. The hours passed slowly, and the storm outside continued to rage, and the shelter walls groaned under the force of the wind. But inside it was warm and safe, and Kira had stopped shaking entirely, and her crystals now glowed with a steady purple light. She shifted in his arms and turned to face him, and they were close now, their faces only inches apart, and her black eyes studied him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Among my people, she said quietly, physical contact is sacred, and we do not touch casually, and to share warmth like this, to trust someone with your body when you are vulnerable, it is an act of profound intimacy, oh, Jake said, and he felt his face flush, and I didn't know, and I wasn't trying to. Kira placed a finger against his lips, silencing him. I know, she said, and that is why it means even more, and you offered without expectation, and you saw me not as an exile, but as a person worth saving. Jake swallowed hard. You are worth saving, he said. Kira's hand moved from his lips to his cheek, and her touch was gentle, and her skin was warm now. Almost hot. My people exiled me, she said, and they cast me out and left me to die. But you, a stranger from a species I barely know. You risked everything to save me, and tell me, Jake Martinez, why are humans so foolishly noble? We're not all like that, Jake admitted. But I think most of us try to be, and we believe that everyone deserves a chance and that doing the right thing matters even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Kira leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and the gesture felt intimate in a way Jake couldn't quite explain. I was wrong about your species, she whispered, and I thought you were weak and scattered and short-sighted. But you are none of those things, and you are kind and brave and honorable, and I am grateful that you found me. Jake closed his eyes and let himself enjoy the moment and the warmth of her body against his and the steady glow of her crystals, and outside the storm raged on. But in here they were safe. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being pressed together on that narrow sleeping platform, and 3 days of quiet conversation and shared meals from the emergency rations, and 3 days of learning about each other in ways that went far beyond simple facts. Jake learned that Kira had been a navigator on her ship, and that she had spent decades traveling between stars, and that she had seen things that would blow his mind. And she told him about her homeworld, a planet orbiting a binary star system where the sky was never truly dark and where vast crystalline forests grew and sang in the solar winds. Kira learned that Jake was from Earth, and that he had grown up in a small town in the southwest, and that he had always dreamed of the stars, and she listened with genuine interest as he talked about his family and his decision to join the frontier service and his love of exploration and discovery. They talked about everything and nothing, and somewhere along the way the situation stopped feeling strange and started feeling natural, and Jake found himself looking forward to the moments when Kira would shift closer, or when her hand would find his, or when she would laugh at one of his terrible jokes, and her laughter was like music. On the 3rd day the storm finally broke. Jake woke to silence, and it was so sudden and so complete after days of howling wind that it took him a moment to process, and beside him Kira stirred and her eyes opened, and she looked up at him. The storm has passed, she said. Yeah, Jake replied, and I should probably check in with the station and let them know we're alive. Kira nodded, but she didn't move, and neither did Jake, and they lay there in the quiet, and the moment stretched out, and Jake realized he didn't want it to end. What happens now? Kira asked quietly. Don't know, Jake admitted, and I guess we go back to the station and we figure out what to do about the information you have, and we find out who attacked those colonies. And after that, she pressed. Jake met her eyes, and he saw the question there, the uncertainty and the hope. After that, he said slowly, I guess that depends on what you want, and you don't have a ship anymore, and your people exiled you, and you're welcome to stay at the station if you want, and we could use someone with your knowledge and your skills. Kira smiled, and it was a real smile that reached her eyes and made those black depths shine. I would like that, she said, and I would like to stay, And with you, if you will have me. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Yeah, he said. And his voice came out rougher than he intended, and he'd like that too. They finally dragged themselves out of the sleeping platform and got dressed, and Jake activated his communicator and called into the station, and his supervisor nearly had a heart attack when he heard Jake's voice because apparently they had assumed he was dead, and the relief in the woman's voice was palpable. We're coming back, Jake said, and I've got a survivor with me, and she's got information about the colony attacks. There was a pause, and then his supervisor said, Get back here as fast as you can and we'll have medical standing by. It took them several hours to make the trek back to the station, and the landscape had been transformed by the storm, and massive drifts blocked what had been clear paths, and the temperature was still brutally cold, but the sun was out and the sky was a brilliant blue, and Kira walked beside Jake, and her steps were steady and strong. When they finally reached the station airlock, they were met by a team of medics and security personnel, and there were a lot of questions and a lot of concerned faces, but Jake just waved them off. She's fine, he said, and I'm fine, and she has information you need to hear over the next several hours. Kira told the station command everything she knew about the attacks, and she explained that a rogue faction of a species known as the Kreth had been systematically targeting isolated human colonies, and that her people, the Valerians, had detected their movements, but had chosen neutrality over intervention, and she gave them coordinates and tactical information and potential weaknesses in the Kreth's technology. The station commander listened to everything and then immediately sent the information up the chain to Federation Command, and he also granted Kira asylum and temporary resident status at the station. And when Jake heard that, he felt a weight lift off his chest that he hadn't realized was there. Kira stayed. She took a position as a xenotechnology consultant, and her knowledge of alien systems proved invaluable, and she helped the station upgrade their defenses and improve their sensor arrays, and she worked alongside Jake on several projects, and they made a good team. But it was the quiet moments that mattered most. The late nights in the station's observation deck where they would sit and watch the stars and talk about nothing and everything, and the shared meals in the commissary where Kira would try human food and make faces at the strange textures and flavors, and the times when Jake would find her in the engineering bay working on some project, and she would look up and smile, and his heart would do that stupid skip thing it always did now. 3 months after the blizzard, Jake found himself in the observation deck again, and Kira was beside him, and they were watching a distant nebula paint the darkness with swirls of purple and blue. I have been thinking, she said quietly, about what Jake asked, about that day in the shelter, she replied, and about what you said when I asked why you came for me. Jake remembered. I said it was the right thing to do. Yes, Kira said, and she turned to look at him, and her eyes reflected the nebula light. And you said it didn't matter what species I was, and that everyone deserves a chance. That's true, Jake said. She reached out and took his hand. I want you to know, she said, that you saved more than just my life that day, and you saved me in ways I cannot fully express, and you gave me hope when I had none, and you showed me that honor. And kindness are not weaknesses but strengths, and you taught me that home is not a place but a person. Jake felt his throat tighten. Kira. She squeezed his hand. I am Valerian and you are human, and by all logic we should be strangers, but I have never felt more at home than I do when I am with you. Jake pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her. You're stuck with me now, he said softly. And you know that, right? Kira laughed and pressed her face against his chest, and her crystals glowed bright and warm. I would not have it any other way, she whispered. And outside the observation deck window the stars continued their eternal dance. And somewhere out there in the vast darkness were dangers and mysteries and wonders beyond imagining, but in this moment none of that mattered, because in this moment 2 beings from different worlds had found something rare and precious, and they had found each other. The Federation eventually tracked down the Kreth and put an end to their attacks, and the mining colonies were rebuilt, and the families of those lost were given closure. And Kira's testimony had been instrumental in making it all happen. And her name, which she had said held no meaning, became known throughout the frontier service as the exile who had risked everything to warn humanity. But Kira didn't care about the recognition or the accolades, and she cared about the work she was doing and the friends she had made, and most of all she cared about Jake and the life they were building together. 1 year after the blizzard, Jake and Kira stood in the same emergency shelter where their journey had begun, and the station had kept it maintained as a backup facility, and Jake had requested permission to visit it, and the commander had agreed, though she had given him a knowing smile. "It's smaller than I remembered," Kira said as she looked around the cramped space. Jake laughed. "Yeah, well, we were both pretty focused on not dying at the time." Kira walked over to the sleeping platform and ran her hand over its surface. "I almost did die," she said quietly. "And if you had not found me, if you had not shared your warmth, I would have frozen and become one with the snow. But I did find you," Jake said, and he came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, and "you're here and we're here." Kira leaned back against him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "And saving me and taking on all the complications that came with it?" "Never," Jake said without hesitation, and not for a single second. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "Love you," she said. And the words were simple but profound, and among my people those words are sacred, and we say them once in our lifetime to the person we bond with. And I say them to you now. Jake Martinez Jake felt tears prick at his eyes. "I love you too, Kira," he said. "And I think I have since that day in the storm when you grabbed my wrist and looked at me with those eyes, and I knew I would do anything to keep you alive." They kissed then, and it was soft and sweet and filled with promise, and outside the shelter the world continued on, but inside time seemed to stop. Eventually they pulled apart and Kira smiled. "Take me home," she said. Jake grinned. "Where is home?" Kira touched his chest right over his heart. "Here," she said, "and wherever you are, that is where I belong." They left the shelter hand in hand, and as they walked back through the snow toward the lights of the station, Jake thought about how strange life was, and how you could never predict where it would take you. And a year ago, he had been just another researcher at a frontier station living a quiet, predictable life. And now he was bonded to an alien woman from halfway across the galaxy, and he had never been happier. The stars shone overhead, cold and distant and beautiful, and somewhere up there were Kira's people who had cast her out, and somewhere were the Kreth who had threatened human colonies, and somewhere were a million other species and civilizations and stories waiting to be discovered, but all of that could wait. For now Jake had everything he needed right here beside him, and as they walked through the snow, Kira began to hum a melody from her homeworld, and Jake listened and smiled and thought that maybe, just maybe, the universe wasn't such a cold and lonely place after all. Not when you had someone to share the warmth with. Not when you had found your home in another person's heart. The end came not with fanfare but with quiet contentment, and years would pass. And Jake and Kira would continue their work on the frontier, and they would face challenges and dangers and triumphs together, and their story would become something of a legend among the station personnel, and a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected places. But that night, as they lay together in Jake's quarters with Kira's crystals glowing softly in the darkness and their hands intertwined, none of that future mattered, and all that mattered was the present, and the warmth they shared and the love that had grown from a desperate act of kindness in a frozen wasteland. Kira had been right when she said humans were foolishly noble, and Jake had been right when he said doing the right thing mattered, and together they had proven that even in the vast cold emptiness of space, even when everything seemed lost, even when your own people abandoned you, there could be hope, and there could be connection, and there could be love. The storm had brought them together. The warmth had kept them alive, and the choice to see each other not as alien and human, but simply as two beings worthy of dignity and care had changed everything. In the end, that was what humanity at its best was all about, and reaching out across the void and saying you matter, and saying I see you, and saying I will not let you face this alone. And in the end, that was what made humans truly special among the stars, and not their technology or their ships or their weapons, but their stubborn insistence that every life had value, and their willingness to risk everything for a stranger in need. Jake Martinez had not set out to change the universe that day. He went into the storm, and he had just wanted to help someone who needed But in doing so, he had saved a life and found love and proven that the distance between worlds was nothing, compared to the connection between hearts. And as he drifted off to sleep with Kira, warm and safe in his arms, he smiled and thought that if he had to do it all over again, he would not change a single thing. Not the cold. Not the fear. Not the uncertainty. Because all of it had led him here to this moment, to her. And that made everything worth it.